In the psychology department at Cornell University, sealed in a glass jar of formaldehyde, rests one of the most infamous brains in American history. Measuring 1,673 cm, it belonged to a man fluent in 8 languages, capable of translating ancient Greek and formulating intricate theories on human linguistics. Yet this same brilliant mind orchestrated a series of savage murders that horrified 19th century America. His name was Edward Howard Rulloff, a teacher, doctor, inventor, philologist, and killer. For years, law enforcement across New York State wrestled with a haunting question: how could such intellectual brilliance coexist with such cold-blooded evil? This is the disturbing story of the man the press dubbed the Genius Killer. A tale where academic ambition was funded by blood and the pursuit of knowledge became a justification for murder. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe and tap the notification bell. We drop new episodes of dark history and unsolved mysteries every week. Tell us where you're listening from. In the comments, your city might just be the setting of our next case. The case of Edward Rulloff would permanently reshape how Americans understood the criminal mind. He proved that evil didn't always wear a monster's face. It could also speak in polished Latin, quote, Goethe, and dine with the town's elite. In 1842, the lush hills of central New York were alive with possibility. The Erie Canal had transformed sleepy farming villages into busy hubs of commerce, and the religious wave of the Second Great Awakening brought reform and revival to the region. Education was becoming the new ladder to success, and small towns competed to attract educated men who could raise their cultural status. It was into this fertile environment that a 23-year-old Edward Rulloff arrived in Dryden, just outside Ithaca. To the townsfolk, he seemed heaven-sent. Tall, dignified, and sharply dressed with piercing dark eyes and an authoritative manner, Rulloff radiated intellect. He spoke like a man used to being listened to and respected. His grasp of botany, medicine, and classical languages stunned the community. He recited Latin and Greek effortlessly and seemed equally versed in philosophy, literature, and the latest scientific theories. When he began lecturing on phrenology, the then popular belief that a person's skull could reveal their character, the townspeople gathered in awe. But behind this sophisticated image lurked secrets that would later horrify them. Born John Edward Howard Ruffson near St. John, New Brunswick around 1819 or 1820, he had already lived a double life before stepping foot in the U.S. His father, a Danish immigrant and justice of the peace, had left the family with modest means before dying in 1827. Edward showed early brilliance, devouring books and dazzling local educators with his intellect. But that brilliance darkened early. As a teenager, he was linked to several suspicious fires at the dry goods store, where he worked arson, likely used to mask theft. When he was caught wearing stolen clothes, he was sentenced to 2 years in prison for embezzlement. Rather than reforming him, prison honed his cunning. He emerged with a deeper understanding of deception and a new identity, Edward Rulloff. The name change signaled more than reinvention. It marked the evolution of a petty criminal into a predator who could seamlessly infiltrate polite society. Armed with new knowledge and carefully honed charm, Rulloff crossed into America. In Dryden, he quickly gained trust, landing a job at the local drugstore where his knowledge of medicinal plants impressed everyone. His reputation soared. He discussed European philosophy, explained global politics, and dabbled in everything from photography to carpentry. In a town craving intellectual stimulation, he was a revelation. Locals began turning to him for advice. Farmers asked about crop rotations. Politicians sought his opinions on policy. Wealthy families invited him to dinner parties, where his wit and wisdom made him the star attraction. Eventually, the town offered him the role of headmaster at their school, a position of honor that granted him access to young minds and greater influence. Among his students was 17-year-old Harriet Schutt, daughter of one of the region's most respected landowners. Harriet was admired for both her beauty and intellect, tall, graceful with radiant light. Brown hair, pale skin, and hazel eyes full of quiet mischief. Her polished manners and articulate speech marked her as well-educated, rare for women at the time. The Schutts had built their fortune through hard work and wise investments, becoming pillars of the community. Her father, John Schutt, was a man of authority and vision, proud of Harriet's promise, and determined to see her married to someone worthy of the family's name. What none of them knew was that Harriet was stepping into the orbit of a man whose charm masked something monstrous. The Schutt family embodied everything steady and admirable about rural American life in the 1840s, prosperous, respected, and rooted in tradition. So when Harriet, their bright and graceful daughter, fell under the spell of her teacher Edward Rulloff, the romance, though intense, was met with quiet concern. Rulloff was undeniably magnetic. Beneath his scholarly charm, he possessed a charisma that seemed almost hypnotic. He told vivid tales of far-off travels and academic triumphs, captivating Harriet with stories of a world far beyond the familiar fields of Dryden. To a young woman raised in the comforts and constraints of rural life, he was the embodiment of sophistication and mystery. But even in those early days, warning signs flickered. Rulloff's temper, unpredictable and explosive, surfaced with unsettling frequency. His jealousy, particularly when it came to other men speaking with Harriet, bordered on obsession. Those around them noticed, but instead of sounding alarm bells, they offered excuses. He was passionate, perhaps a bit tightly wound, but brilliant men often were. On December 31st, 1843, as snow blanketed the Finger Lakes and families gathered to welcome the new year, Edward Rulloff and Harriet Schutt were married in a modest but well-attended ceremony at her family's farm. The day should have been filled with joy, yet even as vows were exchanged, a disturbing truth surfaced. When the minister leaned in to gently kiss the bride's cheek, a traditional gesture of goodwill, Rulloff's face darkened with fury. His eyes blazed with such rage that nearby guests stepped back in alarm. A moment that should have symbolized blessing instead cast a chilling shadow over the celebration. Guests nervously dismissed the outburst as nerves, and Harriet tried to interpret it as a sign of passionate love. But the truth was darker. The outburst revealed something primal beneath the scholarly veneer, a violent possessiveness that would soon define their marriage. What followed was a honeymoon plagued by emotional whiplash. Tender devotion one moment, cold hostility the next. Within months, Rulloff convinced Harriet to move with him to Lansing, a nearby village, where he claimed they could build a more private life. But the relocation was no act of romantic independence. It was a calculated move to isolate Harriet from her family. In Lansing, Rulloff established himself as a botanical physician, applying self-taught knowledge to treat local ailments in a region with few trained doctors. His practice flourished, and so did his reputation. People saw a healer and a scholar. Someone who charged modest fees, spoke with authority, and seemed deeply invested in the well-being of the community. At home, Rulloff surrounded himself with books and ideas. He immersed in linguistic theory, claiming to work on revolutionary insights into the origins of language. His home became a hub for intellectual conversation, and locals saw him as the rare man who could unite classical wisdom with modern science. When Harriet gave birth to their daughter Priscilla in April 1845, there was a brief flicker of peace. Rulloff appeared transformed, gentle, attentive, even loving. He read to his wife and child, painted vivid dreams of a new life in Ohio, and promised that better opportunities awaited. Harriet, ever hopeful, believed him. She had grown used to his grand dreams and trusted his intellect. But the illusion of domestic bliss cracked with the continued presence of Dr. Henry Bull, Rulloff's business partner and Harriet's cousin. Bull was a respected physician who had mentored Rulloff in botanical medicine. His relationship with Harriet was familial, warm, and entirely appropriate within the culture of close-knit rural families. But Rulloff saw something else. The same innocent gestures, like a kiss on the cheek, that had once triggered his rage resurfaced as a proof of betrayal in his mind. No amount of logic or reassurance could convince him otherwise. Despite the absurdity of the accusation, he became fixated on the idea that Harriet and her cousin were lovers. What had once seemed like eccentric jealousy now began to spiral into paranoid obsession. And behind Rulloff's polite smile and intellectual reputation, the storm was building. As spring warmed into summer in 1845, Edward Rulloff's jealousy reached a breaking point. He began tailing Harriet whenever she left the house, interrogating her about every interaction with other men and erupting into violent rages fueled by paranoia. The eloquent scholar who once captivated rooms with his intellect had become a menacing presence inside his own home, consumed by suspicion and emotional instability. The crisis escalated in May, when tragedy struck the Shutt family. Harriet's sister-in-law fell gravely ill following childbirth, and both she and her newborn appeared to suffer from a serious infection. The family naturally turned to Rulloff, whose reputation as a skilled botanical physician had grown. He administered an herbal remedy with apparent care, but within 48 hours, both mother and child were dead. While such outcomes weren't uncommon in a time before antibiotics, Rulloff's disturbing lack of grief and ominous remarks to his mother-in-law, hinting at who might be next, sent quiet chills through the family. The deaths created an irreparable rift. Suspicion grew, and whispers circulated that the healer may have become a killer. Though no accusations were spoken aloud, Harriet's family began keeping their distance, their earlier concerns solidifying into fear. Isolated and under pressure, Rulloff pressed harder for Harriet to leave with him for Ohio, describing it as a place where his genius would finally be recognized and where they could escape the town's judgment. But Harriet, still mourning her sister-in-law and niece, refused to abandon her family. Their arguments turned violent. Rulloff, unable to understand her loyalty to anyone but himself, descended further into delusion and rage. On the night of June 22nd, 1845, as a thunderstorm raged over Cayuga Lake, Rulloff's violent obsession turned deadly. He and Harriet were again locked in an argument, this time about leaving for Ohio. Harriet, in the kitchen preparing spices with an iron pestle, stood her ground. She laughed off his accusations of infidelity and refused to go. That defiance proved fatal. In a fury, Rulloff ripped the pestle from her hands and struck her in the forehead with devastating force. She collapsed instantly, blood pooling on the floor. As thunder rolled outside, the house fell into a haunting silence. Rulloff watched his wife die without remorse, only satisfaction that she would never disobey him again. Then he turned to their crying infant, Priscilla. With the cold calculation of a man more scientist than father, he prepared a narcotic from his herbal supplies. He later described it as a sedative, but the intent was unmistakable. He administered the poison to his daughter, silencing her cries forever. Within the span of an hour, Edward Rulloff had destroyed his family. The next morning, neighbors noticed something was wrong. They found the house in disarray, unmade beds, dishes abandoned mid-meal, Harriet's prized traveling basket and personal belongings untouched. Rulloff claimed his wife and child had gone to visit relatives, but his stories shifted with each telling. First they were near Seneca Lake, then in Erie, then Ohio. None of the tales held up under scrutiny. Harriet's brothers, William and Ephraim, knew she would never leave without telling them. They began their own investigation, questioning neighbors and tracking Rulloff's movements. Witnesses recalled seeing him load a heavy chest into a wagon early that morning and head toward Cayuga Lake, a direction inconsistent with any of his claimed destinations. As suspicion reached a boiling point, Rulloff vanished from Lansing, claiming he was going to retrieve his family. But Ephraim was not about to let him slip away. Determined to find justice, he pursued his brother-in-law across the state in a desperate hunt. The chase culminated at a bustling train station in Rochester. Rulloff tried to disappear into the crowd, but Ephraim caught him hiding in the rear of a train. Even then, Rulloff's confidence never wavered. He smiled and insisted he was on his way to reunite with Harriet and Priscilla, even inviting Ephraim to come along. They traveled to Buffalo together, the tension between them palpable. But the next morning, in the chaos of the docks, Rulloff slipped away once again, this time for good. Back in Lansing, the community mobilized. Based on witness reports, they focused their search on Cayuga Lake. Men worked day and night using nets, grappling hooks, and crude diving equipment to scour the dark waters. It became one of the most exhaustive local investigations of the era. But Harriet and Priscilla Rulloff had vanished, leaving behind only questions, suspicions, and the memory of a family destroyed by the monstrous mind of a man once admired for his genius. Despite weeks of effort, the search for Harriet and Priscilla Rulloff yielded nothing. Cayuga Lake, stretching nearly 40 miles with depths exceeding 400 feet, swallowed any trace of their fate. The water's opaque stillness and vast reach made it a perfect grave for those meant to vanish. Volunteers combed the shoreline and dragged the lake bottom with nets and hooks. But the bodies remained hidden, as if the lake itself conspired to keep Rulloff's secrets. As the investigation unfolded, Rulloff's disturbing behavior in the days after the murders became harder to ignore. Witnesses described a man oscillating between rehearsed grief and unsettling cheerfulness. Most damning was his failure to lift a genuine finger to find his missing wife and child behavior utterly foreign to any truly grieving husband or father. While suspicions mounted in New York, the man once known as Edward Rulloff had already assumed a new identity. Reinventing himself as James Nelson, he surfaced in Meadville, Pennsylvania, where once again charm and intellect opened doors. He ingratiated himself with the local elite, forming a partnership with a respected inventor, and even being offered a professorship at Jefferson College. It might have been the perfect new life, if not for a well-intentioned letter. Albert Jarvis, a young man from Ithaca, whose family had once supported Rulloff, wrote to say that he and his mother were trying to clear Rulloff's name. The letter meant, as encouragement, served instead as a red flag proof that the law hadn't forgotten him. Rulloff fled before the net closed, but not fast enough. In 1845, nearly a year after the murders, he was arrested and brought back to face justice. Without bodies, evidence, or witnesses, the prosecution's task was Herculean. The grand jury, recognizing the difficulty of a murder conviction, indicted him instead for kidnapping. At trial, Rulloff chose to defend himself and did so brilliantly. With the calm of a seasoned attorney, he cited legal precedents, dissected the prosecution's logic, and delivered meticulous cross-examinations. But despite his courtroom mastery, the jury found him guilty of kidnapping in 1846, and he was sentenced to 10 years of hard labor at Auburn State Prison. For most men, prison would have marked the end. For Edward Rulloff, it was a second beginning. He transformed his cell into a study, filling it with books on classical languages, linguistics, and philosophy. He became obsessed with philology, the evolution of human language, and began drafting what he hoped would be a landmark treatise. Method in the Formation of Language. His goal was nothing less than academic immortality. Inside prison walls, he became something of a legend. Guards and administrators sought his advice. Fellow inmates became his pupils. Curious visitors came to witness the spectacle of a man who might have been a professor had he not been a killer. Among them was young Albert Jarvis, who became his most devoted disciple. Jarvis, now entering adulthood, spent hours studying under the imprisoned scholar and remained unwaveringly loyal. When Rulloff was released in 1856, having served his full sentence, justice was waiting. Authorities arrested him again, this time on charges of murdering Harriet. Rulloff, ever sharp, argued that this amounted to double jeopardy, claiming he couldn't be tried again for a crime arising from the same incident. Prosecutors sidestepped the argument by shifting focus. Instead of charging him for Harriet's murder, they indicted him for the murder of infant Priscilla. The trial was moved to Owego to ensure an impartial jury. Again, the case was circumstantial, but the evidence and Rulloff's tangled past were enough to convince the jury. He was convicted and sentenced to death, yet his legal mind had not dulled. His defense launched a sophisticated appeal based on the corpus merciless and on the corpus delicti rule, which required a body to prove a murder had taken place. The case wound its way through the appellate system, attracting legal commentary and stirring debate. While awaiting the appeal's outcome in Ithaca jail in 1858, Rulloff executed his most daring escape yet. He vanished from his locked cell despite tight security. All signs pointed to inside help, and the most likely accomplice was Albert Jarvis. Now employed by his father, the Undersheriff Jarvis had access knowledge and motive devotion to a mentor he still believed was wrongfully accused. The criminal genius had once again outmaneuvered the law, disappearing into the shadows with the help of the very system meant to hold him. And the mystery of Edward Rulloff deepened a story of brilliance, corrupted love destroyed, and justice endlessly outpaced. As a fugitive from a death sentence, Edward Rulloff entered the most prolific and perilous phase of his criminal life. With unmatched cunning, he traversed the Northeast and Midwest under a shifting array of identities, slipping past law enforcement with ease. He was described on wanted posters as armed and dangerous. But no paper could capture the depth of the threat. He posed a man whose intellect and charm masked a heart devoid of conscience. Rulloff reinvented himself again and again, taking work as a teacher, photographer, inventor, even carpet designer. His charisma and sharp mind granted him access to respectable circles where he lived as a gentleman while sustaining himself through sophisticated frauds and thefts. Despite his status as a wanted man, his scholarly aura disarmed suspicion time and again. His luck ran out in 1861, when he was captured and sentenced to 2.5 years at Sing Sing, New York's infamous maximum security prison. Even there, Rulloff thrived. He used his intellect to secure privileges and form strategic alliances, most notably with William T. Dexter, a seasoned burglar. Dexter saw in Rulloff not just a criminal peer, but a mastermind, and together with the ever-loyal Albert Jarvis, they formed a gang that would haunt the Northeast for nearly a decade. The trio focused on high-end burglaries, targeting dry goods stores, carrying luxury textiles and expensive merchandise. Rulloff planned the jobs with military precision. While Dexter and Jarvis executed the heists, Rulloff ensured every detail from escape routes to the timing of guards' routines was perfectly calculated. Based out of Brooklyn, they lived comfortably between crimes, their operations marked by professionalism and a calculated avoidance of violence that made them hard to trace. By 1869, Rulloff's ambitions turned back to academia. Learning of the upcoming inaugural convention of the American Philological Association in Poughkeepsie, he saw a chance to finally claim the recognition he'd craved since Dryden. Adopting the alias Professor Yuri Loriot, he submitted his life's work. Method in the Formation of Language. A dense manuscript built from years of obsessive study in prison and on the run. In his mind, it was a revolutionary contribution to human understanding. He even announced plans to auction the manuscript for the exorbitant sum of $500,000, a staggering amount that revealed both his delusions of grandeur and desperation for validation. But when the academic community dismissed the work and rejected the manuscript entirely, Rulloff's fury was volcanic. That rejection shattered whatever fragile boundary remained between ambition and madness. If scholars would not willingly embrace his genius, he would force the world to reckon with it through crime. His heists became bolder, his tactics more aggressive. Modern psychiatric analysis of Rulloff's behavior concludes he displayed classic traits of psychopathy, manipulative charm, lack of remorse, inflated self-worth, and utter emotional detachment. Even among criminals, he stood apart brilliant, magnetic, and terrifying. He inspired loyalty in men like Jarvis and Dexter, not through fear, but through belief. They saw him not as a villain, but as a misunderstood genius. As 1870 began, Rulloff was unraveling. His dreams of scholarly fame were dead. His criminal enterprises were flagging, and the world still refused to acknowledge the brilliance he believed was his birthright. Then Jarvis brought word of a new opportunity. The Halbert Brothers dry goods store in Binghamton had just received a shipment of fine silks, light, valuable, and easily fenced. The store was poorly secured with only 2 young clerks sleeping above it. The layout offered multiple escape routes along the Chenango River. To Rulloff, it was the perfect target. The trio planned meticulously. Jarvis conducted surveillance, charting the clerks' routines and identifying the best points of entry and exit. Their plan relied on chloroform to silently subdue the men without bloodshed, allowing them to steal the silks and vanish before dawn. On the night of August 17, 1870, under a thick blanket of humid darkness, Rulloff, Jarvis, and Dexter made their move. Frederick Merrick and Gilbert Burroughs, the 2 young clerks, had gone to sleep unaware that one of the most dangerous men in American history was creeping toward their door. Merrick had a pistol under his pillow, a last line of defense against the rising tide of burglaries plaguing central New York. The plan was clinical. They would break in through the basement, use chloroform to incapacitate the clerks, and be gone before sunrise. Rulloff had studied the building's architecture, calculated airflow for the chloroform, and predicted the clerks' reactions down to the minute. His partners believed in the plan completely. After all, how could it fail when designed by a man who once claimed to unlock the very secrets of human language? Moving with practiced stealth, the trio approached the rear of the store and slipped inside. Each step they took was part of a choreography, rehearsed over days, silent, efficient, unstoppable. But what awaited them inside the Halbert Brothers store would become the turning point in Edward Rulloff's long and bloody story. His brilliance, long used to deceive, manipulate, and destroy, had finally led him to the edge of disaster, and soon to the gallows. In the dim basement of the Halbert Brothers dry goods store, Edward Rulloff and his accomplices donned masks and stripped off their shoes to silence their movements on the creaking wooden floors above. They ignited the chloroform-soaked rags, expecting the sickly sweet fumes to rise through the structure and lull the sleeping clerks into unconsciousness. Every step of their ascent was measured and deliberate. They believed the night and the plan were theirs. But perfection needs only a single flaw to collapse. And Albert Jarvis, despite years of criminal discipline, made a fatal mistake. In the dark, unfamiliar space, he tripped perhaps over a crate or stack of merchandise. The crash echoed like a gunshot through the silent store. Upstairs, clerks Frederick Merrick and Gilbert Burroughs jolted awake. In an instant, the well-rehearsed heist descended into chaos. Merrick, acting with extraordinary courage, reached for the pistol he kept under his pillow. He aimed at the shadowy figure of Rulloff and pulled the trigger, but the gun misfired. Undeterred, he hurled a heavy wooden stool at the intruders with force and precision. Meanwhile, Burroughs tackled William Dexter, the 2 men crashing through furniture in a violent tangle. The clerks, though outnumbered, fought with the determination of men defending not just property, but principle. As the struggle escalated, it briefly seemed the young defenders might prevail. Then Rulloff made a decision that would forever redefine his legacy. Drawing his own pistol, he fired a shot into the air intended as a warning. But Merrick refused to back down. Still grappling with Jarvis, he pressed the fight undeterred by the gunfire. Rulloff fired again into the ceiling, a second warning. Still, Merrick advanced. It was in this moment, under pressure and stripped of all his intellectual pretense, that Rulloff crossed a final line. Coldly, deliberately, he leveled the pistol at Frederick Merrick's head and fired. The young man died instantly, his blood painting the very walls that had been his home. The brilliant linguist, who had spent decades pursuing the mysteries of human thought and language, had committed the most brutal act of communication, a killing without words, without hesitation. Time seemed to pause in the wake of the shot, as if even the night itself recoiled from what had just happened. Then Gilbert Burroughs, faced with the horror of his friend's death and the realization that the intruders had nothing left to lose, made a desperate choice. He broke free and ran into the streets, shouting for help with every ounce of breath he had. His cries shattered the stillness of Binghamton's sleeping neighborhoods and summoned police and townspeople into action. Rulloff, Jarvis, and Dexter fled into the darkness, heading for the nearby Chenango River. But whatever strategic clarity had guided their entry was gone. Panic had taken hold. Jarvis, either misjudging the river's depth or simply desperate, assured his companions it was shallow and crossable. They waded in, thinking the river might wash away their sins. But the Chenango River, swollen and swift, had no intention of offering them escape. In the next moments, the darkness that had hidden their crime would turn on them. The water was deeper than expected, the current stronger, and their fate, as carefully planned as it once seemed, was about to unravel completely. As the three fugitives plunged into the dark waters of the Chenango River, the night that had begun as a precise criminal operation collapsed into chaos. Albert Jarvis, wounded from his fight with the clerks and weakened by blood loss, was quickly overtaken by the current. His body vanished into the black water. William Dexter, despite years of burglaries near rivers, lakes, and canals, had never learned to swim. He followed Jarvis into the depths, his cries swallowed by the river's rushing tide. Only Edward Rulloff, gasping and flailing, reached the far bank alive. Drenched and shaken, he could already hear the sounds of the manhunt behind him. Barking dogs shouted orders, the metallic clatter of firearms and boots. The community of Binghamton had risen as one to track down the men responsible for Frederick Merrick's death, and Rulloff, no longer an untouchable mastermind, was running out of time and options. His attempt to flee the city was clumsy and uncharacteristically panicked. At the local train station, when approached by officers conducting a suspect sweep, he made the critical mistake of bolting instead of bluffing. That single action confirmed their suspicions and triggered his immediate pursuit. He was ultimately found, crouched in a farm's outhouse. Hardly the grand setting for the downfall of one of the nation's most elusive criminals. Even in custody, Rulloff tried to manipulate the situation. He gave false names, first Charles Augustus, then George Williams. But the charade ended when Judge Ransom Balcom, a local official long familiar with the case, entered the police station. With pointed authority, Balcom declared, "You are Edward H. Rulloff. You murdered your wife and child in Lansing in 1845. The courtroom fell silent. Decades of unanswered questions suddenly had a face. The judge then warned officers, "This man understands his rights better than you do and will defend them to the last." And he was right. Rulloff immediately launched into legal maneuvering, using every tool and precedent he could recall. But this time, the evidence was overwhelming. At the crime scene, police had recovered a single left shoe modified with cloth stuffing to compensate for Rulloff's missing toe lost years earlier to frostbite. The shoe, unmistakably his, was as distinctive as a fingerprint. Further investigation led to his Brooklyn apartment, thanks to documents recovered from the bodies of Jarvis and Dexter. Inside, authorities found an astonishing array of materials, false identity papers, detailed maps, stolen merchandise, and academic manuscripts. It was a shrine to his double life, equal parts criminal hideout and scholar's study. The trial, which opened on January 4th, 1871, captivated the nation. Over 2,000 people crammed into a courtroom built for half that number. Newspapers sent correspondents from across the country. The story was irresistible. A brilliant mind turned murderer. A linguistic theorist who planned robberies with the same precision he applied to etymology. As always, Rulloff represented himself. He argued with poise, cited law with precision, and cross-examined witnesses like a seasoned attorney. But no rhetoric could overshadow the mountain of physical evidence, eyewitness accounts, and the undeniable trajectory of his life. He had crossed too many lines, and this time there was no escape. Still clinging to the grandiose delusions that had shaped his life, Rulloff petitioned Governor John T. Hoffman for clemency, not out of remorse, but on the grounds that his linguistic theories could benefit all mankind. He pleaded for a stay of execution so he could complete method in the formation of language. The manuscript he believed would immortalize him as a scientific genius. Surprisingly, some prominent voices supported him. Horace Greeley, editor of the New York Tribune, wrote that Rulloff was too curious an intellectual problem to be wasted on the gallows. Others, like Mark Twain, responded with biting satire. In a letter to the Tribune, Twain mockingly offered to send a replacement criminal for execution, suggesting that Rulloff's brain be preserved as a national treasure rather than discarded with the rest of him. Despite the spectacle, the appeals failed. Rulloff's intelligence, however dazzling, could no longer shield him from justice. His long, winding journey from scholar to fugitive, from healer to murderer, was nearing its end. And this time there would be no aliases, no accomplices, and no escape through the river's current. Edward Howard Rulloff's twisted journey ended where his crimes had always been heading at the gallows. On March 3, 1871, he was sentenced to hang for the murder of Frederick Merrick. All appeals, including the bizarre pleas to preserve his life for the sake of his unfinished linguistic theories, were denied. Even the satirical intervention by Mark Twain, mocking the notion that intelligence should exempt a man from justice, could not shift public or legal opinion. While awaiting execution, Rulloff finally confessed to murdering his wife, Harriet. He offered a cold, detached account of how he struck her down with an iron pestle in a jealous rage. But when it came to his infant daughter, Priscilla, he remained ambiguous, admitting only that he administered a narcotic to stop her crying, still refusing to name the act for what it was. On May 18, 1871, before a massive eager crowd that had gathered from across the region, Edward Howard Rulloff was executed in what became New York State's last public hanging. Witnesses reported his final words as either, "Hurry it up, I want to be in hell in time for dinner," or the more understated, "I can't stand still." Either way, his end was as theatrical as his life. Hours later, Dr. Bert Wilder of Cornell University removed Rulloff's brain for scientific study. Measuring 1,673 cm, it was declared the second largest criminal brain ever recorded. That brain, once the source of ancient language translations and cold-blooded murder, is still preserved today at Cornell's Wilder Brain Collection, a grim artifact of one of America's most chilling minds. Rulloff's case sent shockwaves through 19th century thought. It challenged deeply held assumptions about crime, intellect, and morality. At a time when criminality was often equated with ignorance or poverty, here was a man who defied the stereotype. A brilliant linguist, a gifted speaker, a respected teacher, and a ruthless killer. His crimes forced early criminologists and psychologists to ask hard questions. Could intelligence be a mask for evil? Could brilliance coexist with moral emptiness? Rulloff became one of the first American criminals to be analyzed scientifically. His preserved brain a morbid centerpiece in the emerging field of criminal psychology. Yet despite exhaustive examination, science found no structural flaw to explain his darkness. No twisted jury, no malformed cortex, only a chilling reminder that genius alone does not equate to goodness. Today, over 150 years later, Edward Rulloff remains a case study in psychopathy. Experts now recognize in him every hallmark of the condition: narcissism, grandiosity, emotional detachment, manipulation, and the terrifying ability to charm those he would ultimately betray. He was the prototype of what we now call the intelligent psychopath, a man who used intellect not to build, but to destroy. Long before the term serial killer entered the public lexicon, Rulloff embodied its reality. His dual life of scholar and predator captivated a nation and left a legacy not of academic achievement, but of moral horror. He remains a stark reminder that evil can wear a scholar's robe, speak with eloquence, and argue with logic, and still be evil. So what do you think? Should exceptional intelligence be considered in sentencing even for murderers? Or does brilliance make such crimes even more unforgivable? Leave a comment with your thoughts. Was Edward Rulloff's mind too valuable to waste? Or was his execution a necessary end to a life steeped in betrayal and blood? If you found this tale of 19th century terror compelling, subscribe for more stories like this one. Tap the notification bell so you never miss an episode, and share this video with someone who loves history's darkest mysteries. Until next time, remember, the most dangerous predators often wear the most respectable faces, and sometimes the sharpest minds conceal the deadliest intentions. Thank you all very much for watching my video until the end. I sincerely appreciate it, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video.